It's been 103 years to date, September the 14th, that the 1919 hurricane moved into Baffin Bay, major hurricane Category 3 winds. We wanted to bring in somebody with expertise on this, author and historian Mary Jo O'Rear. Mary Jo, you've written 3 books. How are you doing today on the anniversary?
I'm fine, and I'm really glad that y'all are paying attention to it, even though it's not a round number like 100 years. I'm really glad y'all are paying attention to this date.
Yeah, lots of lessons can be just gleaned even looking back over a century. We'll get to some of those lessons, but based on your knowledge, what was the feeling like? Take us back to 1919. It's the summer, it's August, it's getting into September. What were the people of Corpus Christi doing and thinking when they first heard about this storm coming in?
Well, first of all, this was, again, as you said, August. It was near the beginning of the school year, but it was like right before. So a great number of people had come down to have one last weekend with their kids on the beach. And we had some rooming houses. We had basically what we would call motels, and a lot of places on the beach that had families there that had come specifically because they had been assured that no hurricane would hit Corpus Christi. It was immune to hurricanes. So first of all, there was this last gasp to enjoy summer on the beach. And when they did, well, it was kind of difficult to find out about the hurricane because it was coming in from the east, and we didn't have really good communication.
Yeah.
So unless a ship was able to, make land and say, well, there's this horrible storm out here, it was kind of difficult to find out where it was in the Gulf. We knew it was in the Gulf. New York Times was reporting it was in the Gulf. Galveston papers and San Antonio papers were reporting it was in the Gulf. New Orleans was the weather area, the Weather Bureau thing, and they were reporting it was in the Gulf, but nobody knew exactly where. And so the gist of it, and if you were living in Corpus Christi or if you were vacationing here, if you paid any attention at all, well, it's going to hit Louisiana, everything hits Louisiana. And nobody much was paying attention to it that weekend. They did notice that a lot of birds were flying out, especially if you lived, if you were vacationing on Mustang Island or in Rockport or Port Aransas. You did notice the birds were flying out. There was a kind of increase inside, along the bay in Corpus with sea animals. There seemed to be an overabundance of fish and sea animals making their way in, and it was cooler. The winds, which normally come from the southeast, as we know, and they're kind of hot and humid, as we know, were starting to come more from the north, and there wasn't quite as much humidity. So there were signs, but we're immune. So people really didn't pay that much attention. And that Sunday morning, even though there were starting to be telephone calls from some of the signal stations on the barrier islands, most people were, planning Sunday dinner or, getting together and having a cup of coffee at Driscoll Nueces Hotel. Nobody was really particularly worried that Sunday morning.
Why do you think? So we've got the storm in the Gulf. We can't see it because there aren't any satellites up in space yet. We're relying on these ships that are in the area. Why do you think there was such complacency leading up to the landfall of this storm? Was there any reason that you can kind of pinpoint?
Well, yeah, because the area had been hit by another hurricane just 3 years earlier in 1916. And basically it had done more damage to Kingsville, but then it had come on up and it had done a tremendous amount of damage to Port Aransas, to Rockport, to Aransas Pass, and to Corpus Christi. But Uh, there were no real damage reports from Corpus Christi. There was a lot of stuff that was messed up along the piers and the bays on Corpus Christi Beach, and the causeway had been destroyed by it. But the word was out, we don't want people to know we are vulnerable to hurricanes. So the general consensus was that Corpus Christi is immune to hurricanes. And I think there was a big headline that came out not long after the hurricane hit in 1916 that Corpus Christi, was virtually untouched. I do know of some of the people who lived during that period who felt that the winds that came with the 1916 hurricane were extremely severe and very, very dangerous. But again, that was not well recorded. And so the meaning of the message that was getting out to the state, to the world, to the powers that be, was that Corpus Christi had proved itself immune to hurricanes.
Yeah, I had read something similar to that with the previous storms, maybe some of the thinking was that the barrier islands somehow protected the city from surge. So lesson learned on that front. I want to take us now to September the 14th, 1919. The storm is moving into Baffin Bay. It's south of Corpus Christi. People say, well, I thought it hit Corpus Christi. Well, we were on the right front quadrant of the storm, which put us on one of the more violent parts of that storm in particular. What did it do to the city when it came in on September 14th, 1919?
It totally demolished the beach, the business area. It brought in all of these destroyed debris from ships. It brought in dead sea animals. It brought in all of the horrors that had already swept across the Barrier Islands. And the Barrier Islands, St. Joseph or San Jose, Mustang Island, Padre Island, they had buildings on them. San Jose Island had a whole corral of cattle, I think over 400 cattle that were in a corral in that area. Port Aransas had, of course, a town. Plus, on Harbor Island, which was you had St. Joseph's Island, and then you had Mustang Island, and then you had this sort of triangle Harbor Island. It had tank farms there, and it had huge, big containers of oil that had been stored there because there was a port right there on Harbor Island. And some of these got knocked over by the winds. The winds were awful. The sea was awful. There was a place in Rockport where the deluge, the sea actually knocked over one of those big iron safes and pushed it across the floor of what was left of the house. The sea was that strong. And so all of this just came barreling out on North Beach, on the downtown area part of Corpus Christi. And we had a big hospital on North Beach, and we also had an encampment of soldiers who were doing rest and recreation from being stationed along the border with Mexico. And of course, we had all of these homes because North Beach was also now the site of a brand new subdivision for all of the up and coming Corpus Christi young yuppies at that point. And of course, across the little bayou there, Hall's Bayou, there was the whole business section with the piers and the wharfs and Pleasure Pier and all of that. And the sea just destroyed it, just swept it all away and brought in all of this other stuff. And at the same time, destroyed homes with people in them because people had taken it seriously and they were sitting down to chicken dinners, or they were kind of thinking about maybe going out and fishing because it's always good to get fish right before a hurricane blows in. There was a young military couple who had decided to sort of have a hurricane party and ride out the hurricane. And the last that was seen, they had fastened themselves to sort of a makeshift raft just to try to make it over the wind and the waves, and they were never seen again.
I know the
So
sorry to interrupt you because you're talking about North Beach, and I wanted to just ask specifically. North Beach is a very low-lying area in Corpus Christi as we know it today. It always floods, even in Ike, for example, North Beach flooded from the storm surge, and we were on the quieter side of that storm. So to put it into perspective, with this storm moving in 115-mile-per-hour winds south of here, it pushed a 16-foot surge right through North Beach, and I can't imagine what it would have been like having that much water rush across that low-lying area. What did that do to loss of life? What did that mean for residents that live there?
so many of the people fled from their homes, which were already breaking up. Many of them fled up to the roofs, just like they did in New Orleans with that Hurricane Katrina. But a lot of them tried to just kind of survive on the roof. But even so, the water was pushing it, and the thunder and the waves, and they weren't able to do that. And the roofs were collapsing. And there was a young boy with his sister and his aunt who had fled to the roof. And again, this is Sunday morning. The aunt was all dressed up in her fancy clothes. She drowned because the clothing was so heavy. Wow. The young boy and his sister were able to kind of grab onto something and float off, but there were families. There was a young couple that had 2 children, and again, they had been in a home that had survived the 1916 hurricane. They had been assured this is safe, and again, it broke up, and they ended up on the water, and she had tied herself to the younger baby to try to keep it afloat, but then they both went down when the water turned over the raft, and then he lost the other child, and he just gave up and he drowned. And there was just an awful lot of horrible screaming, and there were nuns that were in this hospital. One who had gone out of the safe area, because there was one area in the hospital that was safe because it was right next to the big power plant or whatever they had. And she left it to go into another room because there were 2 patients and another nurse who were crying for her, and they all were swept away by the water and died. It was just a tumult, and it was dark, and it was lightning and thunder and horrible screams.
Yeah, lots of, I'm sure, terrified people considering, one, oh, it can't happen here, and then 2, it's happening now, and we've got to deal with it. So yeah. Not the best situation. I know that Dr. Robert Simpson was a survivor of the 1919 storm. He went on to a great meteorological career, created the Saffir-Simpson wind scale that we use today. So it impacted a massive amount of population, not because it directly hit them, but because of the knowledge and the learning that came out of that storm. So for Corpus Christi, what do you think that Corpus Christi in particular learned and then applied that knowledge moving forward? How did we adapt after that storm to try to mitigate that terrifying experience?
All right, the first way we did it was in a very indirect method of mitigating it. We used all of the resources and the sympathy and the attention that we got to convince the federal government and the state to help this particular town build a deep water port. And the excuse we used when we applied for whatever aid we could get was that we would build a protective barrier, so that would be so protective of the city that it would also, by the way, protect the deep water port that we needed. So the first thing we did was use the vulnerability that we had demonstrated that we were in, and turned it against it to say, because we were so vulnerable, now we're going to build this magnificent protective area that will not only protect us, but will house the deep water port that this area needs so bad. So that was the first way in which we tried to mitigate the effects of the hurricane.
The other ways, I know the seawall is something that came years after. This was 1919. The seawall wasn't put in for another 20 plus years. But did that storm have any influence on how tall the seawall was. You know, we had a 16-foot surge. The seawall is 14 feet, so not quite at that level. What was the play between that storm and the seawall?
Well, actually, there were about 5 or 6 different versions of seawalls that were proposed between the time of the storm up until around 1941, or rather 1939, when it finally got approved and built. It took about 2 more years to build it. And it was really interesting for a while, like when Gutzon Borglum designed his own version of the seawall, it wasn't even as high as the 14 or 15 foot surge that had come in, but his was more built along the lines of possibly beautifying the city. Other seawalls, again, were built or proposed higher. And I believe the justification for this particular one, I'm not quite sure why it didn't quite clear the 15-foot surge, but it was close. Also, what kind of went into it was how it was going to be built and how deep the pilings were going to have to be and how well buttressed they were going to have to be up against the beach. And in effect, what we did was add 2 more miles to Water Street of dredged soil, so that we not only built the seawall, but we also built up the ground that backed it up. So that whole concept of the seawall, you would think, oh, easy, we have a horrible hurricane, we need to put up protection. It took, like you said, over 20 years to actually build it. And there was so much politics and so much back and forth to finally get it done.
I guess some things never change, right?
Absolutely.
There's so many more topics that we could cover. I know we've been talking for maybe 10 minutes. And if anyone out there is wondering about your books, Bulwark Against the Bay, People of Corpus Christi and Their Seawall, and the other one is Storm Over the Bay, lots of information there. You've got them, you're showing them to us right now, a little show and tell. So, you know, that's just the tip of the iceberg with all of your knowledge, and the more that people, I think, can know and understand about what's happened before, the better we can be prepared if and when it happens again. Mary Jo, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.